The weather this week has been kind of crazy. And as of right now, it's still kind of up in the air whether or not we'll be at school uh, Thursday and Friday just because of the crazy weather we've had this week. Gold, you might not need to watch this if we're in school Thursday or Friday. Blue, you've seen the first part of this PowerPoint already. Uh, but the second half is the part that we didn't finish that one day when I was able to do this in class with you, like over a week ago or something like that. I don't know. Times are getting kind of hard to keep track of. Anyway, your next unit, I guess our first unit together is going to be over the early Cold War. So the Cold War was a almost a century defining, or at least half a century defining conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, lasting from 1945, so pretty much right after World War II, up until the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union did eventually collapse and break apart. So this is a very long spanning period of time. There are a lot of things that go into it. This unit is not going to be over the entirety of the Cold War, just over roughly the first 10 years or so. So 1945 to roughly 1955. And during the early Cold War, effectively, when we're talking about this period in history, this is the main quote-unquote battleground that we're talking about. What's interesting about the Cold War, it's called the Cold War because even though there was substantial tension and what you may call saber rattling between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, actual armed conflict between Americans and Soviets did not actually ever take place. So it's cold in that the U.S. and the Soviets never actually fought each other directly. There were plenty of proxy wars that took place between the U.S. and or American and Soviet allies. Things like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s, in the 70s, I think in the 70s. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan anyway. But again, that comes later. This is roughly what we're looking at. The early Cold War focused primarily on Europe and basically dividing Europe into sides and factions. If you look at the map, you can see the main two factions where you have the dark green countries being allies of the United States, and the red countries being or becoming the allies of the Soviet Union. And then you have the light green countries that remained neutral or did not really pick a side. The Cold War was an instrumental and a very formative experience for what has been coined the American century. Because the second half of the 1900s definitely was a period of time when the United States was the undisputed superpower of the world. Even though the Soviets became a superpower, the U.S. remained decidedly more influential and more powerful. And yet, a lot of this period was shaped by this conflict between the U.S. and the USSR. So, where did the Cold War come from? Or how did this thing, if you want to call that, get started? The U.S. and the Soviets had an antagonistic relationship pretty much from the word go, stemming back to the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War in the late 1910s. in the early 1920s, when the U.S. and some other European powers like the British sent money and war material to what were referred to as the Whites, or the anti-communist faction in the Russian Civil War, angering the Reds, or the communist faction that would establish the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was officially established, that the legacy of American interference in a Russian civil war in an attempt to prevent a communist takeover left a bad taste in the mouth of the Soviets, and that kind of made the Soviets more antagonistic of the Americans. And the Americans, following Russia's conversion to communism, also felt or feared a globe-spanning communist plot seeking to topple capitalism and the governments of all the Western countries to impose capitalist government, or not capitalist, communist governments in them. This was manifested in the Red Scare of the 1920s that you should have talked about, when there was this massive fear of anything communist or socialist, which resulted in a massive crackdown on the political left in the United States. Those differences were put aside during World War II, when the Americans and the Soviets recognized that Nazi Germany was the bigger evil, and that it was in both of their interests to work together to topple Hitler. So the US and the Soviets were allies during World War II, albeit with a degree of, if not reluctance, a hesitancy to trust each other, given the past. And as the end of the war neared, particularly after Germany had been subdued and all that was left was to take care of Japan, the relationship between the US and the Soviets quickly began deteriorating toward the end of World War II. And this became clear in the last wartime conference held at Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference, in July of 1945, where it became clear that the Soviets were not going to remain allies with the Western world, and that once their common enemies were taken care of and dealt with, then the old dynamic would effectively resume. A lot of the promises that had been coerced out of Stalin at previous peace conferences, notably his promise to allow democratic and free elections in Eastern Europe after the war during the Yalta Conference, he very much walked back on that promise during the Potsdam Conference, where he made it known that he had no intention of allowing true democracy to take place or to develop in Eastern Europe. So just to put a bit of clarity in this, so if you remember from during World War II, the Germans pushed through Eastern Europe to invade Russia, and the Soviets counterattacked, and basically over the course of sorry, dry throat. Over the period from roughly 1943 to 1945, the Soviets had to painstakingly push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. So basically driving back through all these Eastern European countries that had been conquered and blitzkrieged in the early phases of the war. And basically, now that the Soviets were effectively in control of these countries and occupying these countries because of the war, Stalin made it clear that he was not going to let that influence go away. And this reflects the overall objective for the Soviets in the aftermath of World War II. And what becomes increasingly clear, and especially now that we've got, again, hindsight to look into, is that a lot of this post-World War II tension stemmed from just the totally different visions that the U.S. and the USSR had for the post-war world. Each side wanted to expand its sphere of influence, but with different objectives and for different reasons. The U.S. basically wanted to preserve and spread democracy and, more significantly, capitalism to allow for free trade. Basically, the U.S. wanted to increase the number of trading partners it would have to enrich itself through trade. And the USSR, by contrast, wanted buffer states. So basically, they wanted additional territory between the Russian homeland and any potential threats to discourage or stave off invasions and additional destruction. Here in the picture is a picture from the Potsdam Conference with the big three leaders at that time. So from left to right, you have Winston Churchill representing the UK, President Harry Truman, who became president of the United States after FDR's sudden death in April of 1945 of what I believe was a stroke or a brain hemorrhage, something like that. And then on the right, Joseph Stalin, chairman / dictator of the Soviet Union. Sorry, shoot him at that. So to look more in depth at the origins of these tensions, we have to look more in depth at what the Americans and the Soviets wanted from the end of the war. So their visions were, their goals were heavily shaped by their experiences during the war. When it comes to the United States, understanding the American objective, it's important to understand and keep in mind the U.S., unlike the other allies, did not really suffer direct destruction from World War II. The only time American territory, the United States itself, was directly attacked was Pearl Harbor and some minor skirmishing around a Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands up by Alaska that was quickly beat back. The United States did not suffer anywhere near the same level of destruction and devastation that Great Britain and the Soviet Union and pretty much the rest of Europe did. Kind of the benefit of being separated from the rest of the world by two oceans. So in response to this, the United States emerges from World War II with the clearest, strongest position. There was just no ways about it. Europe, even the victorious powers, they had suffered a lot of devastation and destruction, extreme loss of life. Even American military casualties were not even on the same level as British or especially not Soviet casualties. So, by and large, the U.S. comparatively suffered little compared to the rest of the world, which left it in such a strong position. So the U.S. did not really need to rebuild its infrastructure because its infrastructure and production capacities had not been destroyed. And they did not suffer anywhere near the level of population loss or loss of life that the other countries did. Again, because the American homeland was never directly attacked, very, very, very few American civilians died in the war, which stands in stark contrast to the rest of the world, where a large number of the casualties from countries like Great Britain or the Soviet Union or even Germany were civilians. I think the Russians estimate about 10 million Russian civilians were killed in World War II. The U.S. just did not suffer anywhere near that level of devastation. So the U.S. emerges from World War II having actually enriched itself and gotten pretty wealthy because the U.S. was, in the words of, I believe, FDR or Woodrow Wilson. No, FDR. The U.S. was the arsenal of democracy. We were the people making all the weapons we were the people making the weapons and making all the supplies to ship over to the Allies. So the U.S. had made a lot of money off of that. And the U.S. wanted to continue this trend of economic growth. So to advance that objective, the U.S. was advocating for a rebuilt and democratic Europe to expand free trade and stimulate economic growth. If the end objective for the U.S. was economic growth through free trade, then a rebuilt and democratic Europe would best allow that. If you want to get wealthy through free trade, then what you need other countries who are able to buy your stuff. So the U.S. first wanted a rebuilt Europe that would have the economic strength to actually buy and be good, reliable consumers of American products. And they also wanted a democratic Europe that would not impose extreme trade restrictions on the U.S. and would instead allow what was effectively free trade or unrestricted trade between the United States and Europe. So to that end, again, the U.S. wanted to spread capitalism. That kind of goes along with this. If other countries were capitalists, that creates more trading partners for the U.S. And also the many Americans, particularly those in leadership, believe that capitalism would help maintain peace. If everyone is kind of interconnected through economics and trade, then that effectively takes away the incentive for war. Because why would you want to go to war with somebody that you're trading with and you're making money off of? So they believe that capitalism would effectively provide a form of collective security to guard against another world war. The U.S. was encouraging democracy in Europe, particularly in Germany, and trying to protect the democracies that had been almost overthrown in Western Europe by the Germans. And speaking of Germany, the U.S. was advocating for a reunified and rebuilt Germany. This decision was more than likely influenced by the Treaty of Versailles, or more accurately, the failure of the Treaty of Versailles. When you have a treaty, in that instance, it was a treaty designed and intended to punish Germany. All that did was create the conditions to allow the Nazis and Hitler to come to power and basically start World War II. So in this case, the U.S. is trying to undercut or prevent another world war by not leaving Germany in a weak position that makes it so desperate they'll turn to somebody like Adolf Hitler. So instead, they want a strong Germany to be an ally, and they want to rebuild Germany so that way they'll have a trading partner. These contrasted markedly with the Soviet objectives. So the Soviet Union, when you're comparing the devastation of the Allied powers, the U.S. suffered the least. The Soviets suffered the most. A huge portion of the Russian country, of the Russian heartland, was devastated by the Nazi drive into Russia during Operation Barbarossa. 20 million, it's estimated that 20 million Russians died during World War II. So the Soviets suffered extreme devastation in the forms of just the destruction of the countryside, the destruction of infrastructure and production capacities that were rebuilt during the war, but still a lot of stuff was destroyed, and massive population loss through just so many people dying. And the Soviets wanted to prevent that from happening again. So to that end, the Soviets wanted to establish a network of communist buffer states in Eastern Europe to guard against future invasions. So this is where this swath of territory comes into play. Stalin had no intention of allowing those countries to be truly democratic or to even be non-communist. He wanted them to be puppet governments, or rather, technically independent, but ruled by people who would do whatever Stalin and the Communist Party from the Soviet Union told them to do. And the whole intention of that was to give them a ring of allies around their heartland to potentially head off or discourage any future invasions. The Russians wanted to spread communism, both for a practical concern, because, again, Stalin wanted more allies, but also from a more ideological belief that all conflict arose from economic inequality. And the hallmark of communism is that it's striving to eliminate inequality. In theory, communism results in a classless society where everyone is truly socially and economically equal. And basically, the Soviets believed that if they could spread communism around the world and alleviate the economic inequality that they believed formed the basis of all conflict, then there would be no war, because there would be nothing to fight over. Everyone would be equal. Effectively, there would be no conflict between haves trying to protect what they have from the have-nots, or the have-nots trying to take stuff from the haves. There'd be none of that. The Soviets also believed in economic self-sufficiency. They believed that a country, in order to provide security and stability, a country should produce everything it needs by itself. There should be very minimal trade, which is directly in contrast with the main American goal of establishing of expanding free trade. Because you've got this entire section of the world saying, actually, we don't really want to trade with anybody, and the little trade we do, it's not going to be a lot. So that is kind of the main tension. That's a main tension right there. In addition, the Soviets disagreed with the U.S. over Germany. The Soviets wanted a divided and weak Germany. Again, the Soviets had just been sucker punched by a rebuilt and strong Germany that killed 20 million people just in Russia alone. And they had no intention of allowing that to happen again. So, again, this goes back to why they want the buffer states, but it also goes to they do not want to have a strong unified Germany that would be capable of launching a massive invasion like that again. They wanted Germany divided, and they wanted it weak to ensure there would be no German invasions in the future. Because if you think about it, in the span of like 30 years, between like 1914 to 1945, Russia had been invaded twice by Germany, and they kind of wanted that pattern to stop. So, how did the U.S. respond to this situation? The U.S. saw Stalin's anti-democratic actions in Eastern Europe and his desire to spread communism as a threat to both national security and American economic interests. If Stalin is spreading communism and preventing democracy in Eastern Europe, the U.S. saw that as fewer allies for them and potentially destabilizing and weakening America's position as world power if more of the world becomes communist. Also, If more of the world is communist, that's fewer trade. That's less trade, and that could potentially weaken the American economy. So, effectively, what emerged during the immediate post-war period is that both the Americans and the Soviets came to view capitalism and communism as incompatible. They did not believe that it was possible for the world to survive half capitalist and half communist. They did not believe the systems could coexist properly. And this fed a lot of fears and anxiety about the intentions of the other power. I've often said that during the Cold War, it was basically the U.S. and the Soviets trying to take over the world because they were afraid that the other one was trying to take over the world. To me, that kind of gives a good picture of what this was like, or what motivated the Cold War. So the American response to the Soviet agenda was first articulated in February of 1946 when an American diplomat in Moscow, George F. Kennan, sends what is referred to as the Long Telegram, called the Long Telegram because it was really, 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 really long for a telegram. And the whole point of this, he gives a very in-depth analysis and breakdown of what he believes to be the political and foreign policy objectives for the Soviet Union are. And he gives his proposed solution to how the U.S. should deal with it. And his solution became known as containment, and this was ultimately the main driving force of American foreign policy for the next 50-some years. Containment. Simply put, containment means that you have to contain communism. Communism must be contained at all costs to protect American interests and weaken the Soviet sphere of influence. Kennan and the Americans believed that if they could prevent communism from expanding, it would eventually weaken the communists and the Soviets so much that communism would effectively collapse. And it was also, they believed it was crucial to prevent it from expanding to safeguard American national security, the investments of American corporations overseas, the ability to trade with foreign countries, and overall the U.S.'s position as the major superpower. This was a notable contrast with the U.S.'s previous peacetime foreign policy of isolationism that was practiced between World War I and World War II. So unlike before, where the U.S. actively tried to avoid getting involved in international affairs and basically had the mindset of, we'll leave you alone, you leave us alone, the U.S. was now going to take a very active role in international affairs. Because if they didn't, they feared something like this might happen, where the Soviet Union, the quote-unquote Red Menace, would spread around the world and destroy the American way of life. So, how to implement containment. During the Truman administration, there were 6 major components of containment. First component, nuclear weapons. The Truman administration swore to develop and maintain nuclear weapons. In the post-war period, so from 1945 until 1949, the United States was the only nuclear power in the world. They were the only country to have nukes. And Truman wanted to use that status and that position to gain leverage in international affairs. He believed that it would really discourage countries from angering the U.S. or acting in ways hostile to American interests if they knew that the U.S. had nukes and was more than willing to use them against other people. So to that end, not only would the U.S. maintain its current nuclear stockpiles, but the U.S. would also build more nuclear weapons and expand them, and also try and improve them. And it was during the post-war period that hydrogen bombs were developed, which created bigger explosions than the ones seen in Fat Man and Little Boy when they were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Second tentative containment was a military buildup. So, for the first time in history, the United States would have a large standing army during peacetime. This was significant for a number of reasons, because one, again, this was the first large standing army the U.S. had ever had. Again, previously, whenever the U.S. needed a military for a war, they would rapidly expand the size of it, and when the war was over, most soldiers would be discharged, and the military would get really, really small again. This philosophy stemmed from the founding ideology of the Founding Fathers, who saw standing armies as dangerous. They believed that if a country kept a large standing army around, one, it makes it more likely that that country will use that army by starting wars. So the founders saw large standing armies as directly antithetical to maintaining peace, but also they believed that they fostered greater government control and tyranny over the people. The founders articulated their fears that if a government has access to a large standing army during peacetime, it's very tempting to use that army to maintain its power over the civilian population. However, in this instance, Truman and American leadership said, we may not be at war, but we need to have an army ready to go on standby. So the first large standing army. So to that end as well, military spending just explodes to the point where, I believe in this period, the U.S. starts spending about a third of the federal budget on the military, which I think is roughly about what it is today. Between a third and a half of all federal spending goes to the military. And this is really when that trend starts. Third tentative containment, form military alliances. So, for the first time in history, the United States would have a peacetime military alliance. Historically, the U.S. tried to avoid foreign alliances. This was a trend that went all the way back to Washington's farewell address when he left the presidency in 1796, where he had basically warned the U.S. about how if you get involved in foreign alliances during peacetime, it makes your foreign affairs a lot more complicated, and it makes it more likely that you're going to wind up in a war. However, again, in this instance, American leadership and Truman viewed that as a risk they would have to take because of the threat of the Soviets. So notably, this is where you see the formation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the main military alliance the U.S. is in to this day. Fourth tentative containment, give military and financial aid to allies. Basically, and this is summed up, and this is best exemplified in the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. Basically, if they were friendly nations fearing communist takeover or having communist revolts, the U.S. would help them put them down. If there were countries in severe economic distress that were facing potential communist overthrow, the U.S. would give them a bunch of money to make that problem go away. This is what's known as soft power, where so a lot of foreign policy decisions are divided up into, they're classified as either hard or soft power. Hard power generally refers to the overtly militaristic actions like boots on the ground, send in the military, and just do it through force. Soft power is a more diplomatic approach, or another way you might hear it as phrased as a hearts and minds approach, where instead of sending in the military, they're more diplomatic avenues are searched for to try and win over that country or to solve the problem and make military intervention unnecessary. So again, this could be things like giving friendly factions weapons or supplies, giving friendly countries foreign aid, or even giving neutral countries aid to try and make them more friendly to the U.S. Fifth tenet of containment: expand and strengthen espionage and intelligence agencies. This is where the CIA is formed and comes from. Basically, the notion that information is power, and that not knowing what is going on is too dangerous emerges in this period. And the U.S. creates an intelligence network designed to spy and designed to spy on the world to basically find out what's going on. So the origins of the modern day national security state, and particularly the surveillance state, come from this period. Last tenet of containment: propaganda, to win the hearts and minds of the rest of the world. So basically, ways to show off American culture and to try and make other countries view the U.S. in a more favorable light and think of American culture as positive and, in general, kind of cool. So this would be through things like the Voice of America radio program, which was a radio program broadcast internationally that carried a lot of American content, from music to sports broadcasts to news to just talk. It was basically a radio, an international radio focused on the U.S. The U.S. also made use of what they called culture ambassadors, so figures who were viewed as representing the hallmarks or being pillars of American culture, who could go around the world to, again, show off American culture. Actually, a lot of these culture ambassadors, or some of the more famous ones, were jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong, who, since jazz was a uniquely American form of music, the U.S. government got a lot of use out of jazz as a way to show off American culture. So there was a lot there, and there are a lot of examples to look a bit more in depth at. First example to look at is the Truman Doctrine. So this goes back to tenet number 5, or 5, if I can count. Tenet number 3. So the Truman Doctrine came about in 1947. So for 2 years following World War II, Europe was really struggling to rebuild. Progress had been made, but Europe's economies were still ruined. There was a severe economic depression in Europe following World War II. And the inability of a lot of these democratic governments to effectively rebuild and alleviate the suffering of the people was starting to cause a surge of popularity in communist parties all throughout Europe. Like France, Italy, those were 2 notable countries that saw major support swell during this period for their communist parties. But also, in this case, what were important, Greece and Turkey. In 1947, Greece and Turkey were facing actual communist uprisings and attempts by the communist parties in those regions to take over the governments. And by this point in time, the U.S. had adopted containment as its foreign policy, so something had to be done about it. The situation was exacerbated because the British government, which had previously been supporting both Greece and Turkey with both supplies and money, could no longer afford to do so. The UK had been devastated by World War II as well, and with their economy still being in shambles as well, the British simply couldn't afford to assist the Greeks and the Turks anymore. And the British basically turned to the U.S. and were like, we think you need to take over because we can't anymore. So not only is this significant because one, in just the immediate sense, the U.S. did start giving military and financial aid to Greece and Turkey to defend against their communist upheavals. But also, this marked a symbolic passing of the torch of dominant world powers, where Great Britain was effectively passing its status as world leader to the United States in its request to the U.S. to basically take over and assisting Greece and Turkey. This gives rise, anyway, so the U.S. decision to aid the Greeks and the Turks gives rise to what has become known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine states that the U.S. would provide aids to countries facing communist takeover. Does not matter if you're an ally, neutral, if you're a rebel group trying to overthrow a communist government. Doesn't matter what type of government you are. If you're a democracy, great. If you're an anti-communist dictatorship, also great. We will help you no matter what, as long as you are trying to defend against communism. So this one did help Greece and Turkey from falling to communist overthrow, but it also started a tradition of the U.S. or a period of time in U.S. history where the U.S. was involved with some pretty sketchy and shady governments, and simply because of certain regimes' opposition to communism, the U.S. Tacitly endorsed or condoned some pretty reprehensible stuff. One of the better known examples of this would be the apartheid regime in South Africa, which was basically Jim Crow laws and racial segregation in the U.S. on steroids, where in that instance you had a white minority ruling over a country that was mostly black, but the South African government was able to win American aid and support because it was overtly anti-communist. So basically, a lot of criticism for apartheid in South Africa was deflected by South Africa's status as an American ally. Now, it is telling as well that there was a lot of opposition to it on the international community, and once the Cold War was over, the international community, including the U.S., came out against apartheid in a big way. But again, during the Cold War, kind of because of this notion of the Truman Doctrine, that as long as you're not a communist, we'll help you out, it did get the U.S. involved in some less than savory situations. Another good example of that would be Vietnam. It's through the Truman Doctrine, and they basically just pledged to help governments resist communism that the U.S. got involved in Vietnam in the first place. So yeah, while in theory, again, the U.S. pledged to support only democratic governments, in practice, there were a lot of authoritarian and outright dictatorships that were supported by the U.S. during this period as well from the Truman Doctrine. Other major example of soft power is the Marshall Plan. So going back to the ruined economies of Western Europe, of Europe in general following World War II, this economic devastation was a fertile ground for communism. Again, France and Italy were two Western European countries that saw massive surges in popularity and membership for the communist parties there. The UK, I think, to a lesser extent, saw communism grow in popularity. And in this situation, Secretary of State George Marshall comes in and proposes a soft power option to deal with this. So in June of 1947, George Marshall comes in and says he has a soft power solution to neutralize the communist threat in Western Europe. Basically, give a bunch of money. Just give everybody a lot of money. And this was the Marshall Plan. It was a $13 billion aid package during the 1940s, so adjusted for inflation, that's a lot of money. But it was a $13 billion aid package focused on rebuilding and revitalizing Western Europe. Marshall believed that if the economic crisis was what was giving rise to communism, then if the U.S. were to come in and basically help the European countries out of this economic depression, then communism would lose a lot of its popularity. And he was right. A lot of the communist parties, once these European nations started to see economic revival, communism lost a lot of its popularity and support. So the Marshall Plan really did effectively weaken communism, and at the same time, it rebuilt Western Europe into some really strong and vibrant economies that made very valuable trade partners. So the U.S. was able to make, the U.S. was really able to make a lot of progress toward its post-war vision through the Marshall Plan. By rebuilding these European economies, they were simultaneously weakening communism and creating trade partners who thought very favorably of the U.S. for going in and helping them out. Anyway, on the left, this is George Marshall, who, prior to being Secretary of State, he was, I believe, a general. And then on the right, a pie graph showing the distribution of funding of the Marshall Plan. So as you can see, the biggest beneficiaries were the United Kingdom and France, but West Germany got a lot as well. So a number of countries benefited from the Marshall Plan. Okay, on to tenet. Well, actually, this kind of covers tenets 2, 3, well, no, not so 3, well, like 2 and 5. The National Security Act, also passed in 1947. What happened in 1947 as far as the Cold War was concerned? So the National Security Act laid the groundwork for the national security state. The National Security Act is what officially stated the U.S. would build up its military. The National Security Act is what established the intelligence community. This was a pretty monumental piece of legislation. It turned the War Department into the Defense Department. It centralized military leadership under the Secretary of Defense, who oversaw all branches of the military. So, in that essence, the National Security Act was aimed at making the military more efficient and fostering greater cooperation between the different branches of the U.S. military, and to make it more effective. The military size was quadrupled under this piece of legislation, and the military now started taking about 1/3 of the federal budget. This also established the Central Intelligence Agency to conduct foreign espionage. So a lot of what our modern, how our modern military is organized, and the way our modern military works, the way the intelligence community works, or even the existence of the intelligence community at all, stems from this law. This is the law that established the U.S. as going to have a large standing army in peacetime. A large standing army that would get a lot of funding, that would be made more efficient and have leadership streamlined, that would have an active surveillance state or intelligence community to spy on perceived threats to the nation and respond to them in ways they saw fit. We'll look a bit more at some of the actions of the CIA during the Cold War. But the CIA did a lot of stuff. A lot of their espionage activities, they ranged from simple intelligence gathering to trying to encourage Soviet agents or Soviet officials to defect and basically switch sides and join the U.S., to trying to prop up government allies, like in foreign countries, or to weaken and destabilize foreign governments, either by propping up opposition or rebel forces, or outright overthrowing hostile governments or assassinating key individuals. So the CIA was doing a lot during this period and throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Okay. Things got more intense. Our tensions got higher over Germany. So in 1948, the US, the UK, and France decided to unify their occupation zones in Germany, which angered the Soviets. So when we say they're unifying their occupation zones, after World War II, this is what Germany looked like. So it was divided up into 4 occupation zones. In the east, you have a British, French, and an American sector. And in the east, did I say east? In the west, you had a British, French, and American sector. And in the east, you had a Soviet sector. Since the capital of Berlin was firmly within the Soviet sector, the capital as well would be divided up into 4 occupation zones: an eastern or Soviet zone, and then 3 western zones, 1 for the British, 1 for the French, and 1 for the Americans. In 1948, the Western Allies were like, hey, we're just going to ally or unify all of our occupation zones into 1. And the Soviets did not like that. So in June of 1948, Stalin decided to make a move to punish the Western Allies for taking a firm stance against him and effectively directly contradicting his post-war goal, where you start to see the process of Germany rebuilding and reunifying. So Stalin cuts off all access to West Berlin in an attempt to starve the city and gain leverage over the other allies. Since West Berlin was firmly within Soviet territory, up to this point, it was purely because the Soviets were allowing American, British, and French travel and traffic to go into that portion of the city that it was able to happen. After 1948, Stalin cuts off that part of the city. In response to his threat, the Western Allies, notably the Americans and the British, began what is referred to as the Berlin Airlift, where they flew supplies literally every day. I think every hour of every day. Like there was a constant stream of American and British planes flying supplies into West Berlin as a way to counter Stalin's attempted siege. When it became clear that the attempted shutdown was ineffective, the Soviets reopened West Berlin in May of 1949 after almost a year. And in that same month, the country of West Germany was established, also known as the Federal Republic of Germany, which was a capitalist democracy. It very quickly became an American ally and a valued trading partner of the U.S. In October of 1949, the country of East Germany was established, officially the German Democratic Republic, which was a communist puppet state to the Soviet Union. So Germany did remain divided, and each side of Germany reflected the post-war goals of its main sponsors. So here, again, you have West Germany, the American Allied democracy, and in the East, you have East Germany, the Soviet communist puppet state. Okay. Going back to talk about military alliances, April 4th of 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, which was America's first peacetime military alliances. Its original members included the United States, Canada, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Italy, Iceland, Norway, and Portugal. It was later expanded to include Greece, Turkey, and West Germany. The main mindset behind NATO, it's actually a really simple organization unified behind one pretty simple concept. An attack on one is an attack on all. All the members of this alliance pledged military support if any member is attacked. So again, an attack on one is an attack on all. The whole point of this was to try and discourage discourage the Soviets from trying to destabilize or attack some of the weaker countries in the alliance. This benefited stronger countries like the U.S. because it gave them more allies. It helped spread democracy and capitalism and gave them trading partners. And it benefited the smaller and weaker countries by basically giving them a shield to protect them from a potential foreign aggression. The Soviets countered this in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact, which was a military alliance of the major communist powers in Eastern Europe. So the Soviet Union, Poland, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and Romania. And the Warsaw Pact was pretty much the same type of thing that NATO was. An attack on one is an attack on all. And that was meant as a Soviet counter to NATO, where the Soviets were basically trying to discourage American aggression against some of the weaker communist states. Ultimately, the decade of the 1940s would end on a high note for the communists, though, because of two major achievements for communism. In May of 1949, the communists won the Chinese Civil War, which had been a very long war that had lasted for well over 10 years. The Chinese Civil War had begun prior to World War II and stopped briefly during the war, only to pretty much immediately resume once the Japanese were gone. But in 1949, the communists win, and the Communist People's Republic of China is established, which is the Chinese government of today. At the time, led under Chairman Mao Zedong. The communists had a broad support in China because of their promises for land reform, and also because of extreme corruption within their enemies, the nationalists, who were supported by the United States. So this was not only a major win for the Chinese communists and for communism on the world stage, this was also kind of a bit of a wake-up call, if not a slap in the face to the U.S., because the nationalist faction that the Americans have been supporting proved to be too weakened by incompetence and corruption to win the support of the people, and they were overthrown by the communists. So that was a pretty major loss with China becoming communist. The second major, I guess, oh crap moment the Americans had came in September of that same year when the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic bomb, making them a nuclear power. This was a shock to the Americans. All American intelligence had indicated that the Soviets were still years away from getting an atomic bomb. So now, in 1949, the Soviets become a nuclear power and demonstrate they have the capacity to build nuclear weapons years earlier than the Americans predicted. And so this sets the stage for a bit more tension in the 1950s between the American world and the communist world, which we will look at in later units. All right, so this has been a long video, so I'm not going to drag things out. Again, those of you that will not be in class to get this lecture, either because of snow or ISTEP or whatever is going to happen, this will help you. This will basically give you access to the notes. Those of you that will be in class, and if we do a lecture, again, a lot of this is kind of up in the air right now just because of the weather or potential weather we could get this week. So either way, you'll still have access to this. So take care, guys, and I will see you when I see you.